Imagine you are standing at the edge of the Taklamakan Desert. The year is 100 AD, and the air around you smells of camel dung, dried apricots, and something else, something sharp and foreign that you cannot quite name. It is silk. Bolts of it, wrapped in oiled leather and loaded onto the backs of a caravan that stretches so far into the heat haze that you cannot see where it ends. These merchants have already walked for 3 weeks from the Chinese city of Dunhuang, and they have another 3 months of desert, mountain, and bandit-haunted steppe ahead of them before they reach the markets of Samarkand. And yet, they will make this journey. They will make it, because what they carry is worth more than gold in the courts of Rome, in the palaces of Persia, in the temples of India. What they carry is changing the world. But here is what the history books rarely tell you. The Silk Road was never just about silk. It was never just about trade. It was the most dangerous, most consequential, and most misunderstood network of routes in human history. A living, breathing system that carried not only luxury goods, but religions, plagues, technologies, and ideas across 5,000 miles of the most hostile terrain on Earth. It connected civilizations that had no other way of knowing each other existed. It made empires fabulously wealthy and brought others to their knees. And buried within its history are secrets that most people never hear about. Secrets that, once you know them, make the modern world look very different indeed. To understand what made the Silk Road so extraordinary, you first have to understand the world it was born into. The year is approximately 130 BC, and the Han Emperor Wu of China is facing a problem that no amount of military genius can easily solve. To the north and west of his empire roam the Xiongnu, a confederation of nomadic warriors whose cavalry raids have been terrorizing the Chinese frontier for generations. The Great Wall, still being extended and reinforced at enormous human cost, is helping, but only just. Emperor Wu needs allies. He needs them far to the west, beyond the deserts and mountains that his people have never crossed. In the kingdoms his maps show only as vague shapes at the edge of the known world. And so he does something remarkable. He sends a man named Jiang Qian into the unknown. Jiang Qian sets out with a party of over 100 men into territory that no Chinese diplomat has ever entered. Almost immediately, he is captured by the Xiongnu and held prisoner for a decade. He escapes. He continues west. He travels through the Fergana Valley, through Bactria, through lands that will one day become Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, speaking with kings and merchants and nomads who stare at him with the same fascination with which he stares at them. He does not find the military allies he was sent to secure. But what he brings back to Emperor Wu is something far more valuable. He brings back knowledge. The knowledge that there are vast, wealthy, sophisticated civilizations to the west, civilizations hungry for what China produces, and producing things that China desperately wants. Within a generation, the routes that Jiang Qian had traveled were alive with merchants, diplomats, monks, and spies. The Silk Road, though nobody called it that for another 18 centuries, the name was coined by a German geographer in 1877, had begun, and the first great secret of this road is hiding in plain sight, in the very commodity that gave it its modern name: silk. The Chinese had been producing silk for at least 3,000 years by this point, and they guarded the secret of its production with a ferocity that bordered on the paranoid. The penalty for smuggling silkworm eggs or mulberry seeds out of China was death, not imprisonment. Death, because the Roman Empire, which was consuming Chinese silk at a rate that its own senators found scandalous and economically ruinous, had absolutely no idea how silk was made. Roman scholars theorized that it was combed from the leaves of trees. Others believed it grew naturally in some distant forest. The actual answer, that it was the cocoon of a caterpillar, laboriously unwound into threads of extraordinary fineness, was one of the most valuable industrial secrets in the ancient world. But what you're about to hear next is the part of this story that most people never encounter, because the Silk Road's most transformative cargo was never silk. It was never spices or glass or gold. The most world-altering things that traveled those 5,000 miles of desert and mountain were invisible to the naked eye. The first was religion. Buddhism was born in northern India in the 5th century BC, and for several centuries it remained largely confined to the subcontinent. But the Silk Road gave it wings. Merchants and monks traveled the same routes, stopped at the same caravanserais, those great fortified inns that dotted the road every 30 miles or so, the ancient equivalent of a highway rest stop. And in those spaces of enforced proximity and shared exhaustion, ideas moved. Buddhist missionaries followed the trade routes east into China, where the faith took root and transformed into something new, something distinctly Chinese, eventually spreading further into Korea and Japan, and becoming one of the world's great religions. Christianity moved east along the same roads. The Nestorian Church established communities deep into Central Asia and even into Tang Dynasty China by the 7th century AD, leaving behind stone crosses in places most people would never think to look for them. Islam, after the 7th century, would use these same ancient pathways to spread with breathtaking speed across the entire length of the route. 5,000 miles of road, and every faith in the world walking it simultaneously in both directions. But if religion was the Silk Road's most spiritually significant invisible cargo, it was not its most deadly. That distinction belongs to something so small it cannot be seen at all. And here's where the story takes a turn that connects directly to one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. The Silk Road was also a plague road. Disease like silk and spices and faith traveled those interconnected routes with devastating efficiency. The Antonine Plague, which swept through the Roman Empire between 165 and 180 AD, and may have killed up to 5 million people, is now believed by many historians to have originated in the east and traveled west along Silk Road trade networks. The plague of Justinian in the 6th century, which may have killed a third of the Byzantine Empire's population, followed similar pathways. And then, in the 14th century, came the catastrophe that makes all others pale by comparison. The Black Death traveled the Silk Road. The bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, originated in the rodent populations of Central Asia, precisely the region through which the Silk Road's central routes passed, carried by fleas on the backs of rats that lived in the grain stores of caravans. It moved westward along the trade network with horrifying speed, reaching the Crimea by 1346, carried by Genoese merchants to Sicily by 1347, and from there fanning out across Europe in a wave of death that would kill between a third and half of the continent's entire population within 5 years. The very connectivity that had made the Silk Road the engine of civilization's greatest achievements became, in this moment, the mechanism of its worst catastrophe. And yet, even knowing all of this, even knowing the plague, the death, the bandits, the desert crossings that could kill an entire caravan in a single waterless week, the merchants kept coming, because the profits were staggering. A bolt of Chinese silk purchased in Chang'an could be sold in Rome for 100 times its original price. Roman glass, which Chinese craftsmen could not yet replicate, commanded fortunes in the courts of the Han dynasty. Lapis lazuli from the mines of Badakhshan, in what is now northeastern Afghanistan, was so prized that it appears in the treasuries of civilizations across the entire ancient world. From Egyptian pharaohs to Mesopotamian kings, to the artists of Renaissance Europe, who ground it into the pigment ultramarine, quite literally the most expensive blue in the history of art. This is the revelation that sits at the heart of the Silk Road story. It was not a road. It was not even a network of roads. It was a living organism, constantly shifting, constantly adapting, constantly finding new pathways when old ones closed, new commodities when old ones lost their value, new civilizations to connect when old ones fell. When the Roman Empire fragmented in the west, the Byzantines stepped in to control the western end of the routes. When the Sassanid Persian Empire collapsed before the Arab conquests of the 7th century, the Silk Road did not die. It reorganized, with Arab and Muslim merchants becoming its new dominant force, carrying with them not only goods, but the Arabic numerals, the astronomical knowledge, and the medical texts that would help spark the European Renaissance centuries later, when the Mongol Empire in the 13th century swept across the entire length of the route in a conquest of almost unimaginable violence. It paradoxically created the conditions for the road's greatest flourishing, the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, which made it possible for a Venetian merchant named Marco Polo to travel from Venice to the court of Kublai Khan and return with a story that Europeans found so extraordinary they assumed he had invented most of it. He had not invented any of it. The world was simply larger, stranger, and more connected than anyone in Europe had been willing to believe. And then, in the 15th century, the Silk Road began to die, not because the demand for Asian goods disappeared. If anything, European appetite for spices, silks, and porcelain was greater than ever. It died because the Portuguese figured out how to sail around Africa. Vasco da Gama's arrival in Calicut in 1498 opened a sea route to Asia that bypassed the entire overland network, undercutting the prices of every middleman from Constantinople to Samarkand. The great caravan cities of Central Asia, Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, began their long, slow slide into obscurity. The caravanserais emptied. The desert routes that had carried the world's most precious cargo for over 1,000 years fell silent. But here's where the Silk Road stops being ancient history and becomes something urgently, uncomfortably relevant. In 2013, the Chinese government announced what it called the Belt and Road Initiative, a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure project spanning over 100 countries, building ports, railways, highways, and pipelines along routes that follow, with remarkable precision, the ancient pathways of the Silk Road, The stated goal is economic development and connectivity. The unstated implications are geopolitical and profound. History, it turns out, has a very long memory. And the routes that Jiang Qian walked 2,000 years ago, half-starved and newly escaped from a decade of captivity, are being walked again, this time by engineers, diplomats, and the invisible flows of global capital. The forbidden secrets of the Silk Road were never really about silk. They were about the fundamental human hunger for connection, the desire to know what lies beyond, the next mountain range, the next desert, the next horizon. Every merchant who loaded a camel in Chang'an and pointed it west. Every monk who walked those dusty routes, carrying nothing but a satchel of sacred texts. Every diplomat who crossed 5,000 miles of the world's most hostile terrain, carrying letters between kings who had never met. Every one of them was answering the same question that drives exploration today. What is out there, and what can we learn from it? The road answered that question for 15 centuries. It answered it with silk and plague and religion and art. It answered it with the Black Death and the Renaissance, and Marco Polo, and mathematics, and ultramarine blue. It answered it, in the end, by making the world. And somewhere out there, beneath the sands of the Taklamakan and the stones of the Karakoram passes, beneath the ruins of caravanserais that nobody has excavated yet, there are still answers waiting. Still cargo that never reached its destination. Still tablets and letters and objects that crossed half the world and then were simply lost, waiting for someone to find them and ask the right questions. The road is still speaking. We just have to learn how to listen. History doesn't stay buried forever. That's what this channel is about. Finding the stories that got lost somewhere between then and now, and bringing them back into the light where they belong. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribing is the best way to make sure you don't miss what's coming next, because the next story is, if anything, even stranger than this one.